So I will just give an introduction to where we're going, what's inspired Hawkwood to have this conversation. So we actually welcomed Justin and Daniel to our Climate Action Lab. So this conversation was born from that, and it's a conversation that matters, discussing arts and regeneration. So if you know Hawkwood, we're an arts and educational charity, so moving into what cultivates and regenerates humanity and the planet from a heart-centered place is fundamental to our work. You know, we're seeing work done by organizations that we admire, such as Julie's Bicycle and the Arts Council, where they're bringing together arts and culture into sustainability. And their recent campaign for COP26 was their Culture COP26, which was, again, encouraging the visibility of culture within sustainability and its power. And from that, Annika Eriksson wrote for the Rolling Stone magazine. She says that Maya Angelou is attributed to have said that I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And from her perspective, getting people to feel the need for action is not the work of a scientist, it's the work of the musician, the writer, the artist. And again, we have an artist, Sumik Datta, who has come and done artist residencies with us, and he did this beautiful Songs of the Earth, again commissioned by the British Council this time, but for COP26. So yeah, if we're courageous to acknowledge what challenges us, if we're curious enough to inquire about our current lifestyles, you know, what can happen next? You know, as humans, we have the capacity to bring beauty, but perhaps, you know, we're often too busy to see or act on this opportunity. So this conversation about arts and the importance of artists and art and regeneration is really exciting to us, and I hope it is to you too. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Justin Hopper and Daniel Christian, who, as I mentioned, were in our Climate Action Lab, and their regenerative colleagues and friends, Lisa Shaw and Bridget Mckenzie. And we'll kick off this conversation. I will pass over to Justin.
Hello, thank you very much. And thank all of you for being here. It's pretty sort of amazing. It's nice to be back online after all these in-person events the past few weeks. But I'm just kidding. But I'm just going to take literally like 2 or 3 minutes and it's slightly boring, but I think it'll be useful to sort of present a framework of what's going to happen during this conversation, because we're going to start in a non-conversational manner, which is probably not the way these usually go. So this event is a conversation that began during Climate Action Lab, as we were saying, and back in November, and I interviewed Daniel about his work, and we ended up speaking both in that event and a little bit offline about the role of the arts in both creating the situation we're in climate-wise and as a catalyst for change towards regeneration. And Daniel had the fantastic idea of bringing Bridget and Lisa in from 2 related but different perspectives on the same subject to join him and further that discussion. And so in a way, what we're doing is actually exactly that. We're expanding something that has begun in a very sort of small way and germinated. We're expanding that discussion with the expertise and the experience that these 2 activist arts practitioners bring to the table. So just to lay out what we're going to do, Bridget and Lisa, and you don't have, Bridget and Lisa will introduce themselves. I was just thinking, actually, if this makes sense, Natalie, I can Control V with 1 click of a button, paste each person's bio into the chat, and then everybody can see that. So now you see Bridget Mckenzie on your right. She'll be the first person to speak. But so what's going to happen is Bridget and Lisa are each going to take a few minutes to introduce some aspects of their work and their ideas. Then Daniel will come in, talk for a few minutes about his own work and about what we've heard from them, and kind of bring that into the beginnings of a shape. And then I'll come back in and we'll begin the actual conversation part of our conversation that matters. I'll try to steer the ship around a little bit towards some points that have come up before, some new things, some things that you add during the chat. And at the end, we'll have some time to answer some of your questions or bring up some of your ideas and comments. So it's a bit more participatory in that way. So if that sounds good, with that little bit of groundwork laid, I'm really pleased to hand things over to Bridget Mckenzie, who I'm very pleased to say I have, as of this year, known for 10 years, which is quite exciting. But Bridget Mckenzie of Climate Museum UK, you can see in the chat her bio, and Bridget, take it away.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to immediately share my screen. Being a visual person, I can't easily speak without something to show. So I'm going to talk about culture, the trauma sphere, and healing in place. So I'm not going to talk about whether the arts and culture have a role to play. I'm going to talk about what they have to do in order to make change. And the change that's needed is about healing. It's about health and healing. So just a little bit of background about the work I do, and then I'm going to talk about some big kind of principles and ideas. So a lot of the work I've done in the past is research, evaluation, working for Flow Associates, my own company. But in 2019, I really stepped up my cultural activism, which had actually been very strong since around 2008. But I stepped up by being involved in co-founding the movement Culture Declares Emergency. And this is a movement of artists' ecological emergency. And not just that, they don't just rest with that, they move on to take action. So I've just noted that my internet is unstable. So I'm hoping that my audio at least is okay. The other big organization or ambitious project that I started in 2019 is Climate Museum UK. And this is a mobile, digital, distributed museum, in fact, stirring and collecting responses to the climate and ecological emergency. And it's distributed because we're a team of creative people based across the UK. And we produce and gather art, objects, ideas, games, books, and then we use them to activate people. We come together in joint projects, but we also work locally in our neighbourhoods with other cultural partners. So we don't put on exhibitions, we call these activations. So they help people to play and make and think and talk about the Earth crisis, to open their imaginations to possible futures, and essentially to take action to bring them into being. And we have many principles and approaches, but really conversation is the main medium. It's, we absolutely, well, as Renee Lertzman here says, the reason why we have a pervasive environmental melancholia is directly related to the fact that we're not really talking about this. So my theme really in this talk is about trauma, emotional disruption, and how we need to talk. So the activations that we run, they are conversations where we use stimulus materials. On the left is an installation where we dressed as animal curators of a wild museum, and participants created a wild regenerative museum with clay. On the top right is another of our associates, Amy Scaife, who has a cargo bike, and she travels around with a range of conversational materials. That's just two examples of many. And the context that we're working in is that we're not just focused, our name is Climate Museum UK, but we're not just focused on climate. We see climate trauma as being part of a bigger by historical biosphere trauma. And this term, the trauma sphere, has been introduced by Gia Woodbury, who's an eco-psychologist. And I've created this diagram to create my own understanding of it. So, biosphere trauma is the planet suffering due to extractive, exploitative capitalism. And then human trauma has been a long historical result of this, due to biocolonialism. And then at the center of that is intersectional trauma, where some people are more affected than others. But then climate trauma is kind of moving in like this great, I don't know if you've seen the film Melancholia, it's like this planet coming to, hit Earth, which is going to be creating, absolutely uncertain impacts, worsening biosphere trauma. So that's the context. And as Greta Thunberg says, our house is on fire. So our house is not just our environment, it includes the culture, the human cultures and its products. And so culture is suffering, it will be threatened, it is threatened, but it's also helped kindle the fire. So the question is, what can culture do to quench the fire while it is also, on fire itself? So my suggestion is that at least we need a trauma sensitive approach. So we could talk a lot about what this means, but in a nutshell, it means an expanded perspective where we think from a wide perspective of everywhere, every when, and everyone. So that the wideness has to be also balanced with a place-based approach where people can deal with particularities and have their hands literally and metaphorically in the soil. It has to be collaborative, supportive, compassionate. It needs to be done in ways that are, horizontal and democratic with radical transparency, and it needs to be accepting of emotion. So, I also would argue that we have to take a broad approach to how culture can take action. So rather than just kind of following trends and copying what we see happen and only just spotlighting some practices, we have to take this, broad multilateral approach. And we've come up with this framework called Culture Takes Action. So this is Climate Museum UK working in partnership with Culture Declares Emergency. And it sort of asks the question, what if we put culture in the donut, which is Kate Raworth's economics framework, where we need to create a safe and just space for humanity within the limits of within this ecological ceiling. So these are the 8 pathways that could help to create a regenerative culture. And I would just add really that a lot of focus has been on decarbonising cultural practices, but that's sort of looking inside the house of culture, and that house is less on fire than the wider house of the planet. So we have to look outwards. And back to Renee Lertzman, she's inspired me with her golden trine of behaviour change. And this is analysing how people's responses to conflicting desires affects their response to the emerging Earth crisis. And the 3 areas of response are denial, disavowal, and rationalizing. And in order to overcome them, we have to think about how culture can help people discover truths and histories of the trauma. So supporting reparation, how emotional and social response, how we can engender emotional and social responses to living with the impacts as they unfold in the unfolding present. So how can we support resilience? And it has to help explore solutions and grow an appetite for system change. So supporting regeneration. And so our work is a lot about looking forward. In Climate Museum UK, we're less about collecting the past really, and more about looking forward, supporting visions and plans for transition. These are just some collages of mine that try to capture extractive culture compared to a more regenerative culture. Another thing that we need to do is to rethink how publics or audiences are understood or segmented. Typically, cultural organizations see people as audiences or cultural consumers, sometimes users of services, more rarely as communities of interest. But we have to think of them as caring communities of bioregions, or, you know, the inhabitants of ecosystems. So we have to think about culture in terms of bioregions, and this is, I've been inspired by Daniel in thinking like this, and I've written a couple of pieces in response to some writing by Daniel. And we also have to be post-utopian. So this is about not being in fixed positions of either dystopian or utopian, but facing the worst scenarios, imagining the best, and weaving the two together. So to sum up, culture is nature. It's within the trauma, but it has helped make it. The traumatized world needs trauma-sensitive cultural experiences. Cultural practice can and must pivot to planetary first aid, and that means being bioregional, salutogenic or health-focused, post-utopian, and having multiple pathways, not just reducing its own footprint. And culture has to be for reparation, resilience, and regeneration. So that's my talk. I'll stop sharing, and I presume mute myself so that someone else can speak. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much. Lisa, are you still with us? Yes, there you are. Can you unmute yourself? And I'm going to put Lisa's, thank you very much, Bridget. That was fantastic, really fascinating. I've written down a lot. And Lisa Shaw is up next. Again, I'm going to paste her bio in the chat. And can you try to share your screen and see, let's see what happens.
Is that working?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about this. I feel like it's something is not quite working. On my end. Okay, there we go. Oh, gosh, technology. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And that was really inspiring, Bridget. I'm kind of amazed, and I love the idea of the Climate Museum and look forward to hearing more about your work as well. So it's a real honor to be here. And earlier today, I was speaking with my husband, Galen, about some of my ideas for tonight, and our children were listening. And my older son, Jasper, all of a sudden yelled out, "The rubbish people, the beach rubbish people, you have to talk about them." And I hadn't been thinking about that, but I realized, oh, actually, that is start. And it's a project that I supported him. Rubbish that had washed up on local beaches to where we live. And he made them into a family. And is this working? Oh no. Yes, there we go. Of a mom, a dad, a daughter, and a boy. And this provoked a really interesting dialogue in our family about our consumer and throwaway culture. And children's toys are usually made of plastic, and they have a very short life. They usually last only, a few months and then end up in the rubbish dump. And so there's a lot of learning around this. And we ended up going to our local dump and gathering some broken toys and asking friends for broken toys. And we also made some sea monsters, kind of broken toy sea monsters from this. And I think of this as being about intergenerational legacies and what's the kind of future that we want for our children and for future generations. I studied art and design at the Cooper Union School of Art in New York City. And I'm interested in how we can rethink the role of art and design. In 2006, my husband and we decided to move to Scotland, to the Findhorn eco-villages, along with my parents. My father is Scottish, but he'd lived in the States for many years. And part of the reason for this is we really wanted to live in a way that was closer to nature and in community and close to family. And one of the things we had been longing to do was to grow our own food. And 9 years ago, we were able to start that process. We had a piece of land that was really quite degraded, sand, and it had foxholes left over from the war. And through building up the soil, we've been able to create quite an abundant garden. And together we started a business called Biomatrix Water. And it's really about combining art and design and engineering and science for regeneration of waterways. And so we make floating ecosystems or floating gardens, and these go into usually urban environments, and they're creating green space and habitat in what is often quite a hard-edged or lifeless environment that might have concrete or sheet pile edging, and it's very hard for nature to be able to find a toehold. And so putting in these floating ecosystems creates habitat both above and below the water. And so it attracts birds, it attracts insects, and under the water fish, and also microorganisms that cling to the roots of the plants, and they help to clean the water and improve the water quality. And it's also about helping people to connect with nature in their daily lives. It creates these mini, pocket parks and green spaces in the city. And the people really enjoy and benefit from this interaction. This is a project in Rennes in France. It's the world's longest floating riverbank. And when it was launched, it was quite exciting. It was a real celebration. And we had this floating band that came and played. And this is just a very short clip. You can hear the band playing. And the product is made from almost entirely recycled and natural materials and is also recyclable. And we've done over 100 different projects in the UK and internationally. So I like to think about the idea of deep beauty and rethinking beauty. It's not the superficial beauty, but how can we look at beauty in a different way? Beauty that is cyclical, that is beautiful in birth, in life, and in death. Unlike that plastic toy, which is extractive of natural resources, has a very short life, and then ends up in the rubbish dump. If we can look through time to the past and the future of our creation in order to determine if it's in fact beautiful. This is an example of a project we did very close to home for the Findhorn Bay Arts Festival. And it's a biosculpture in the pond there. And we had local school children come and they planted plants and helped to launch the ecosystems. Community engagement is a really important part of the work. It's really about connecting people to care about and want to steward their water, which is actually such a natural instinct. And these kids, they come to the pond frequently, they come to feed the ducks, and there's a nice walk around it. And now they feel this sense of connection and ownership and being a part of this installation, this art piece, and also of helping to improve the water quality of their pond. I also am interested and like to do more different types of art, more traditional art. And so I created a installation in the barn that was right next to the pond of paintings of inspired by the underwater life of the pond and also of the floating ecosystem and its impact on the waterway. And this painting is called Infusion of Life. The ecosystems can also take different forms, creative forms. This one is in the shape of a narrowboat and was for the National Waterways Museum and has a wooden bow on the front. And we've been a part of different art trails. This was a project in Belgium, in Kortrijk, for the Country Live Art Trail, working with artists there and also having a big group of school children who came and helped to plant. And we have a real vision of living water cities. What if the waterways in our cities could become eco corridors to provide habitat for wildlife and connecting up these green spaces right within the heart of our cities. Water is a huge theme for me in my life, and my slides are going slowly here. Sorry about this. I don't know why it's not going. There we go. I find myself really drawn to our local river in Fintorn. It's this beautiful wild place, and painting the river. And for my 40th birthday, I had this idea that I wanted to create a kind of experience ritual of connecting to the river in a creative way. And I decided to make a water dress. And the dress is made from recycled materials and antique lace that I painted and beaded. And it was kind of marking this new phase in my life. And this was last year that it happened. And I find myself thinking about, what are the ways that I am consuming and that I could engage differently through that. So I've been making my own clothes through organic cotton, with recycled materials. I made this dress that I'm wearing right now. And I like to think about, how can our lives become an art form? And during this past year, with the children home so much in lockdown, there was this kind of opportunity to work quite a lot with the kids in a creative way. And so we spent a lot of time out in nature. And we made different creative projects, working with natural materials and seeing what inspired them and going from there. One of the projects that we did was part of the 100 Days project, where people would choose some kind of medium to work with that they would do every day for 100 days. And so we decided to make nature mandalas. And here's just a short selection of those. Many of them were with things from our garden that we had harvested and then we ended up eating, or with different items from nature that were fallen or were very abundant in our garden or on the local beach. So I'm really interested in and inspired by this idea of how can art be regenerative? How can our creativity be used in a regenerative way? and how to bring a simple and mindful practice into daily life. So thank you so much. And I'm going to try to stop the sharing. Having some issues with my mouse.
Thank you, Lisa.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. That was really, as you can see in the chat, people are really inspired by your work, and I'm certainly one of them. We'll come back with lots of things more to hear from you. Daniel Christian Wahl's bio is now in the chat, which I imagine means that he's going to speak to us. Daniel, would you like to talk a little bit about yourself and what you've just heard?
Well, first of all, I just want to celebrate this all coming together. And I also love the way that you opened up by actually telling the story of how sometimes these things emerge from just a brief impulse of us talking just before we started with the Climate Action Lab, that we should really be talking about how arts and creative practitioners could not just join as an add-on this transformation that is underway, but actually step right into the center of it and become the driving catalytic agency that actually creates these regenerative cultures that right now might, for many people, still seem a little bit abstract. One way I find that helps me to make them a lot less abstract is to always start with the bow towards the roots. And that means to reframe how we understand life and recognize that there is a way, and like some of you might know Fritjof Capra, I once had a wonderful conversation with him where we came to this agreement that one way of framing what life actually does is that as a fractal or scale-linked regenerative community, it creates conditions conducive to life. It regenerates. It keeps improving the planetary biosphere in such a way that more life can happen. And once we recognize that, then this kind of aim of regeneration doesn't become some sort of new fad that everybody kind of has to scratch their head and say, how can I do a bit of that? Everybody seems to be talking about it. But it suddenly becomes a return to the way that things have been and should be and will always be, and we will be a footnote in evolutionary history if we don't make that turn. And so that suddenly then reframes the last 7,000 to 8,000 years, agriculture and the age of power over of city-states, of empires, as the detour, and makes us recognize that our indigenous elders all over the planet were actually place-based, place-sourced indigenous cultures. And almost at the absolute core of it is an economic question, which is a shift in perception, which is all those place-sourced inhabitory cultures that lived as regenerative presences in the ecosystems that brought them forth, didn't have a vision of that land belonging to them. They had a vision of them belonging to that land. And it is this fundamental shift of us stepping back into the circle of the family of life, of becoming regenerative again, because we understand our own creativity as an expressions of nature's, of the place's creativity, that I think is the juicy bit about regenerative cultures. And we will never get there unless people sing about it, dance about it, write poetry about it, do paintings like Lisa about it, have a relationship like Lisa has to the Findhorn River. That is inspiring. That shows and bridging in this flowing way that Lisa is a good friend of mine, and we've known each other for many years. So I'll just blow her trumpet for a little bit, and I'm sorry about that. She often humbly isn't even aware how much she bridges living, like this beautiful question she posed. I actually quoted it in the, how can our lives become an art form? For me, that is stepping back into taking full responsibility of our creative agency. We've been robbed of this potential that we have of actually shaping the world around us with the people around us. And we all do it all the time, but if we become conscious of it, we can ask the question, do we just want to repeat what the media and soap operas and whatever is putting into our heads, or do we want to actively engage in conversation with place, with each other, to say, how could we shape this place differently? Charles Eisenstein's, how could we live into this beautiful place our heart knows is possible? It's that kind of shift that I feel we will only see if we engage the creative arts. And in the interest of actually wanting to have a conversation, I'll leave it at that, because I think we'll have a much richer space in the conversation part.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Actually leads directly to well, I can't decide. There's two things I wanted to bring up that you've sort of led directly to, but I think I'll start with the more joyful one, which is that Lisa, in some of you may have seen Lisa's TED Talk, which is online, about her idea, which she mentioned a little bit, but not in too much detail, this idea of deep beauty. And I'm really taken with that, because my background personally is much more in conceptual art, and it's a very conceptual version of a way of looking at the art world. So her deep beauty idea, which she will explain in a moment, I hope better than I will, kind of looks at things through a conceptualist's eyes, in that it isn't just about making an artwork. It's the materials that go into that artwork. It's the venue in which you're showing that artwork. It's the way in which you communicate the artwork to the audience. And in other words, Lisa talks about beauty as being, for example, I'm just going to throw out an example there. Many of you in England in particular will be familiar with the painter John Constable, perhaps England's most famous 19th century painter. And his works are traditionally considered to be works of incredible beauty and profundity. And I think that through this idea of deep beauty and through a conceptual artist's eyes, we might see those very same paintings as being ugly, because they are in fact paintings of a very specifically industrialized moment, an industrialization of the natural world. They're paintings of a point of view that says, I'm looking at a world that I own, and I own it because I can place it within this frame. Lisa's idea is that that is, by definition, not beautiful. And so I'd like to start by throwing this back to Lisa, but everyone involved is going to have things to say about this, I know. How can we move the conversation, and through the conversation, move the sort of Western world's philosophy in a direction that sees all of those participants, the materials, the venue, everything, as being part of what makes an object or an idea beautiful? Lisa.
Oh, thank you, Justin. Yes, the concept of deep beauty is in many ways taking many of the ideas from circular economy and then putting them within a kind of art language, where within the art world, and as creative people, we think so much about beauty and we judge so much about beauty, and yet I've just questioned in myself, is this real beauty? And so much of it is not. So much of it is actually, it's the old paradigm. It's extractive, it's consumptive, it's ending up in the rubbish as well. It's not based on natural systems. It's not cyclical. I love the looking to nature for inspiration, and the idea that the waste of one thing can be the food for another. And in our work with Biomatrix, we see a lot of that. It's, from some of the most ugly and polluted waterways, for example, where we've worked in India and the Philippines, and then by using nature and the healing power of nature, you can see it transformed into flowers. And, you know, in some of those projects, the people who live there will come and they'll harvest the flowers and sell them, or trade them in the local pub in exchange for a meal or a drink. And it's kind of, you know, from wastewater to flowers, this kind of circular beauty. And I think, you know, you said it really well, Justin, as well, when you were talking about this idea that it's a deeper listening and a deeper thinking, that I think that artists and creative, you know, everybody is creative, designers, all of us need to think about, you know, where are the products coming from that we're using in this? What will happen when, you know, the show is over, when this has been displayed, you know, how will those materials then be used? And what is the concept? Can we create art that is regenerative, that is actually making a difference? And I think the idea of art now, many of the most inspirational art that I've seen recently has been kind of about moments, and it's about experiences and relationships. It's not so much about creating stuff, it's about creating deep beauty.
Fantastic. Bridget, can I ask you a similar question? What role do you think we have in, you know, in transforming this idea of beauty? How does your work and your thinking relate to the idea of transforming the philosophy of the people, in our case here in the UK, but certainly around the West, transforming that philosophical idea so that it sees, you know, the way a museum gets its funding, as, just for an example that you've worked in very specifically, sees that as being a participant in the act of an object becoming a work of art, and a beautiful one?
That's a slightly complicated question to answer. I might just go back to what I was going to say when Lisa was speaking, if that's okay, that I totally appreciate, you know, this work that enables people to see beauty and know it, and to kind of almost experience that deep and archetypal sense of desire, you know, to continue beauty and to nurture it, you know, to be the gardener, to create it. But I also want to kind of point to that that sense of loss that we have, you know, when we experience natural beauty, the wild, and we know that it's threatened, or, you know, we remember beauty from the past that is no longer there, or yeah, the increasingly the sense of beauty and love for the natural world is being tainted and balanced with fear and loss. So I think that cultural work has, you know, a really, you know, it's got this increasingly kind of difficult role to play. You know, it's, when I say difficult, I mean, it's, you know, a process of difficulty to transform itself, so that we are supporting people to, you know, steward beauty, while also coping with its loss and enabling people to stop the harm, you know, to stop the loss. And so therefore culture has to be more activist. And the trouble that we have in the UK and many other places is that our political system is seeing culture as being just about beauty, you know, just about this kind of superficial, commodified beauty. And so, you know, beauty for entertainment, for escape. So, you know, how to engender more ecocentric thinking that is about defending, you know, gardening, defending, and yeah, I think that's my big question, really, you know. And there are a few questions there in the chat which are actually about the how, you know, how do we structure and resist the harmful structures? I'll stop there.
Can I come in?
Yeah, Daniel, yeah.
I just listening to you, I just feel that there is maybe a link between what Bridget brought up earlier around the trauma sphere And we brought up the importance of the centrality of art's role in questioning or changing perception of relationship, of bringing us into new relationship with something, or into deeper relationship with something that we are in deep relationship with but not aware of. And that is a huge power, and beauty is one door into that, and stunning people with a beautiful artwork can start that conversation, or inviting them into the process of creating beauty out of nature, of more than human nature's beauty. I think when we talk about this, we always fall into the trap of naming nature as other. And I just want to briefly name that, and I will do it probably, and we've done it in the past in this conversation, but we all know we include nature or us in her. But I think this for me, when I saw your presentation before you gave it today, Bridget, I thought that there's a little bit about the trauma question and how central it has become in particularly Anglo-Saxon British cultural discourse, and American as well in the last year. And I think it's really healing. It's part of the salutogenesis of naming these traumas. But then I was also thinking of it in terms of the kind of regenerative framing from not addressing problems but potential, and how we can get very abstract about trauma. And then it actually is like solving a problem. And anybody who's traumatized will know that kind of way of treating trauma doesn't work anyway. But we can also see the gift in the trauma, as hard as that is, and it's for many cases a question too tall to ask. But in that healing, like this Cahill Gibran's "The pain cracks the shell of our understanding," we all know in our own lives that it's been the difficult, traumatic situations that have offered us an opportunity to grow in ways that we never thought we could. And I think that's exactly where there's a sort of connection point in what we're bringing together here in this exploration. We don't know, and I feel like it would be lovely to continue this because this is a cultural, creative, really central, important conversation, and I really appreciate both presentations. Briefly, I would love to have another conversation with Bridget all around the culture takes action framework and putting culture at the center of the donut and what you presented. That's so rich. And I put in the chat for anybody following the article that Bridget mentioned, and also the original piece on cultural institutions. Like for me, this is opening up a space that is really, like Bridget really, I encourage you all to look at that article about museums, and you can see that she's put a lot of thinking into it, because like if we could get a group of museums together to have that conversation, we could influence millions of people and begin a cultural creative discourse that could make a difference.
Bridget or Lisa, does either of you want to continue with that?
I kind of shifted topics, sorry.
No, that's fine.
Just a little quick response. I don't want to jump ahead of Lisa, but just quickly, that probably unspoken in my talk was the notion that culture responds to trauma in a way that focuses on potential rather than the problem, and that, you know, culture is immensely effective as therapy in the broadest sense, because of the way that it enables openness to creating new possibilities. It enables people to heal by seeing a future for themselves, by by creating something outside of themselves, and relating to other people. So and I don't want to diminish culture by saying it's just therapeutic. And when we see that the planet is in a state of trauma, we can't just see therapy as a small, narrow thing about just healing some, something that has been diagnosed. it's actually trying to resist and overturn extractive, harmful global industrial systems, while enabling people to cope with the impacts of that system. So yeah, sorry, maybe Lisa wants to come in.
Yeah, Lisa, did you want to respond to any of that?
I'm not sure if I have a huge amount to add to that, but I find it very relevant, the whole aspect of trauma. And I really love the way that you're addressing that through the Climate Museum and through the kind of dialogical aspect of it. It feels so important to engage people in healing their trauma and expressing their trauma, because I mean, what we're facing in terms of the degradation of the planet, the extinctions, all of the possible and probable effects of climate change, it's so big. And I think we don't feel it a lot of the time. We become really numb to it. And it seems like you're giving it this really important space, and through a very creative and accessible lens. And I really love and appreciate that a lot.
And Lisa and I have done both work with Joanna Macy, visiting Findhorn and other places, and Joanna's work in the 1980s, when it was around the nuclear holocaust and the threat of like the mutually assured destruction MAD strategy that the Soviet Union and the USA were running, and literally threatening to bomb the planet out of existence. She started a set of workshops that were called Despair and Empowerment workshops. And behind it was the psychological understanding that if we do not go into that dark space of scratching below that numbness, below that wall we've built around our hearts, below that story that has become us because otherwise we feel dysfunctional and we don't even dare to reach out to others who feel equally dysfunctional. And so this space of opening up a sharing place where people can share how deeply they feel about the damage we're doing to each other and the world is a absolutely necessary step in stepping forward into empowerment. And that's really the key bit, is like, first, don't ever open up that space for somebody if you're not capable of holding what might happen. And that is the danger of working deeply with people's trauma. People need to really know what they're doing. And then also to bring it from that place into a place of positive action to a larger whole, like Bridget was saying. Like the most healing out of trauma or depression, the minute you engage people with care farming or like any kind of caring for other and being of value, having meaning again in context because of having made a contribution to context, that is regenerative. And people rediscover their own unique essence, their own unique potential to contribute to a larger whole meaningfully. And ultimately, that's what education should do, and also that's what art should do, to enable a relationship with each other and with place and the natural world, the more than human world, that is enabling, that by serving others, we serve ourselves.
You've mentioned, Daniel, yourself, Bridget, you've also in a different way in your presentation mentioned this idea that that culture is in some ways complicit in the Earth crisis, in the situation in which we find ourselves, as I often say. And I'm really interested in, I'm a writer by trade. I've been thinking about storytelling, and I've been thinking about language as you've been talking. I've been thinking about the fact that we use this word nature, that we all know we shouldn't, in a way, we shouldn't use it that way. We should put it in scare quotes or find a different way of talking, or talk about the non-human or the more than human. But we still use these words. We're still embedded in a storytelling that kind of exists in this traumatic situation, as I think Bridget has illustrated. And I'm really interested in how we storytell our way towards a different version of this? What role, not just language in the way of sort of novels or journalism or something like that, but a much broader sort of sense. I'm going to actually put in the chat a piece of work by an artist I adore named Daisy Ginsburg called The Substitute, which I think is a supreme act of artistic storytelling for our time. It's an AI generated virtual white rhino, now extinct, that it places within the room in which, in the gallery. It's a truly, I think Bridget was talking about this quite nicely, that it's the kind of piece that opens up trauma in a way that creates that conversation that Bridget is talking about. I wonder if the three of you could talk a little bit about storytelling and how we can, maybe not how, but what's kind of necessary in turning the way we tell stories through artworks, through the way we communicate artworks, and through narrative forms like, like writing and filmmaking and music and those kinds of things. Does any of the three of you want to begin perhaps to talk a little bit about that kind of narrative use? Anyone want to put their hand up? I know I'm supposed to throw to someone, but I'm not quite sure where that goes. Should I just give it back to Daniel and we can move from there? Because I bet he's got thoughts on the storytelling aspect of this.
I could go, but Bridget, do you feel like...
I can. Yeah. So I think that there's been a lot of talk about, story has a kind of precedence. It has it's up there at the top of the list in terms of what culture can do. And I also want to point to art as repetition or ritual, to culture as inquiry, so opening up and breaking apart stories, and culture as actual making, in the way that Lisa's work actually makes environments and improves them. And in some ways, of course, you can tell stories around that, and everything can trigger a story. But I think in a way that the problem is that culture has been controlled by being about, a single voice, a single person's story, rather than about multiple, multivocal ways of coming to an understanding. So, that's why it's really important to open up culture to Indigenous and Black and diaspora ways of being, because those cultures might include narrative, but they also include cultures of care for environment, and cultures of giving voice to other species. So those are the kind of open approaches to storying I'd want to see more of.
That's really interesting. I was actually, oh, it says I'm still muted. No, I was actually thinking, while you were talking about trauma, I was thinking about the First World War and the kind of poetry that came out of that, the Dadaist kind of poetry and surrealism and these things that exploded that language in a way that that I think is actually a sort of, a century-old version of what you're talking about in a way, something that ends that linear concept. Daniel and Lisa, does either of you have something to follow on from there?
Yeah, just briefly, like when Bridget was speaking, I wrote down right relationship again, coming back to relationships, and how all of that, art as ritual, culture as inquiry, is all really historically, when you put it back into that larger framing that I was talking about earlier, how were we in right relationships when we were still living as expressions of place? And I'm not saying that we now need to all go back to a planet with 500 million, or not even a few 10 millions of inhabitants, living in the way that early humans did. But we do need to reconnect our human story back into what has actually helped us evolve as a species. For us, 9,000 years seem like a long time, but for life, 9,000 years is not a long time. For biology, that's just about the time when you get the last warning, you're going the wrong track, extinction is near, change your ways. And that's right where we're at as a species. We've had 9,000 years of detour, and now in that detour, we picked up a hell of a lot of fascinating skills that can blow ourselves to oblivion in no time, but they can also work magic. Any sufficiently advanced technology is undistinguishable from magic, as Arthur C. Clarke said, I believe, or was it William Gibson? Doesn't matter. But the point being, if we want to have this conversation in the context of how do we become regenerative again, not as one culture, but as diverse cultures expressing place all over the world in their unique way, where we see our diversity that Bridget was talking to as part of life's diversity. And therefore we don't see it as a problem that we don't agree and that we have different attitudes for sex, ethnicity, blah, 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 blah. We let people live because the diversity, like letting all the opinions in the room, naming bigotry, naming racism, but still engaging with these people that somehow have these worldviews and really seeing the diversity as part of life's diversity and as part of the friction that actually creates the evolutionary and regenerative impulse, that we need to be in right relationship with each other and with place. And so how do we make in the 21st century that marriage of deep indigenous wisdom from all of the world's indigenous cultures without making it look like a going back, but making it look like a going forward? And that, to my mind, and this is another space where culture and art and technology is merging anyway at the moment. So culture has a critical role in bringing in a much more nuanced discourse on the use of technology. How do we use technology? When do we use technology? Is it possible, and how would it be possible to decide consciously that yes, we're capable of creating this technology, but we're choosing not to use it because it, yeah. Sorry.
Taking that right relationship idea, Lisa, that's obviously something that's very prevalent in your work and something that you're thinking of. You know, you're moving around. I can't remember where you are currently, but some of the work you showed us was all over Europe, for example, and I think you're perhaps in the Middle East at the moment. But Lisa, could you talk to us for 2 or 3 minutes maybe about being an artist who's working in a medium that both allows you the freedom and the imperative to work in that kind of right relationship?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge, but I think it's a really, really important question that Daniel brings, and I think we all need to ask ourselves, you know, how can we enter into right relationship? And I think in many ways, you know, we have some answers, we have some examples through looking at the way people throughout history had lived in right relationship. And it's just, you know, since the beginning of, you know, agriculture or the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, however you think of it, you know, that there's been such a change into this consumptive kind of lifestyle, but it's almost like we've completely lost touch with how to live in that way. And it almost feels impossible in some senses. And I think coming back to storytelling, what we really need is stories of hope and stories which are showing, you know, the examples of how we can do this. Because I think in the media and so much of what we hear is not that. It's you know, stories of kind of despair and of kind of you know, the different, and in some ways there's such a short attention span too. It's like a little bit of this, a little bit of this, you know, the corruption of politicians, the this and that. We're manipulated by these news stories, losing track of what are the like really fundamental points, like, you know, climate change, which needs to be in the forefront of all of the discussions, and really showing, you know, how can we make changes in art, in design, in our lives, in, you know, technology, in, you know, the way that we work, the way that we raise our kids, the way that we eat, the way that we travel. You know, it's just, you know, we need all of these stories, a complexity of them coming from people around the world of all different types, really showing our interconnectedness as well, that we are nature and that we can be nature and live as nature. Yeah.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Yeah. I'm going to sorry, someone? No. I'm going to we've got about, I think, 20 minutes. I'm going to bring in a question from the chat. So just a quick reminder that you can put, I know there's lots and lots of stuff in there. If you have a question directly for the panel, if you put it in all caps, then it'll be much more readily noticed by the Hawkwood team. But I'm going to scroll back through it in a moment as well. But for the moment, Vicky has asked, how can we remove the huge amount of judgment and need to follow a trend that works, that I believe stifles our individual creativity, and instead learn to freely express and find all the hidden talent and ideas latent in so many that don't believe they are creative because they've been told they are not? I think that's a really great question when we're talking about, you know, the sort of Boysian idea that everyone is an artist, and these ideas of living a creative life. How can we sort of, you know, that's a storytelling situation as well that needs to be exploded, isn't it? Does any of you have an answer for Vicky, or thoughts, I should say, for Vicky? Bridget.
Yeah, I would like to suggest that it isn't just about storytelling. It isn't just about how we describe the value of culture and how it should be more demotic or more about ordinary creativity. But I think it's about creating new conditions for cultural practice that are more participatory, but in particular more ecocentric and more situated in places, so that if people are invited to be creative in a setting that, or in multiple settings that are more about how we continue life and how we relate, you know, how we have right relationship, then it's more likely that it will be more inclusive. Do you see what you know? It's sort of like a pyramid of priorities. We have to get the base right. We have to make our work more ecocentric, and then it will become more participatory, more inclusive, and less about commodity and taste and elitism. And you might argue, you know, that there's a role for the Arts Council to diversify and so on, and to fund work that is more participatory and inclusive. And they are really trying to do that. But without supporting work that is ecocentric, I just don't believe it will happen properly.
So just to clarify for myself and perhaps others, are you saying then that in order for those participatory actions, those kinds of artworks that bring in lots of people, they need to be rooted in an ecological mind. They need to be rooted in a different mindset. But is it also the case, are you also saying that the art that they see others produce needs to be grounded in that for similar reasons?
Yeah, we need to change the culture. Yeah, so that it's seen that we value work that continues life, practices that connect us to biodiversity, work that restores and regenerates, work that work that develops people's echo capacities, that is all about health. You know, people are incredibly motivated by health. You know, health is not separate from the environment.
Yeah, we're part of the natural world, and we want a healthy natural world. Daniel.
Yeah, this is really juicy. I mean, there's so many places to go from here. Well, first I wanted, early on when Bridget was speaking, I always want to plug Lucy Neal's work, because she's a real example of somebody who is an artist and an activist, and is precisely doing that, making art a cultural happening, a participatory event where you don't know what the artwork will look like before you've engaged everybody in making it happen. And it's just a wonderful book that I highly recommend. But this central, coming back to health as something that everybody can engage with, and food is another thing that everybody can engage with, and the link between health and food has been ignored for far too long. And suddenly, when you just engage local people, make the bridge to local producers and local farmers, which makes the bridge to the local environment, and the double role of farmers as not just producers of commodity, but as guardians of the local ecosystems. And so suddenly you already have participatory community engagement. And it's in those spaces that I find that we can then explore together the healing power of, and I'm saying creative practice on purpose, because it can be art or design or ecological technology. It can be a living machine ecosystem. It can be an active edge floating system that brings new biodiversity into the area. And the beauty isn't when the installation happens. The beauty happens over the next year as the installation gets inhabited by fish and all of that underneath and above ground. And suddenly the river comes back to life, and there's dragonflies and butterflies that you haven't seen in that area. And that's total beauty and deep beauty. And that's where the English language gives us a real sort of hint by healing, health, wholeness, and holy being all from the same root. And when we understand health as a dynamic process, not as some sort of static state that we fall out of and then have to come back into when we have a problem, but if we see the potential of being in positive health as shit happens, stuff will be thrown at us, we will get ill, but we will continue to evolve with it and work on positive health. We will create a different health system, but we also have a much different engagement with food, with local production, with the materials we use. And I want to go back to something that Lisa said that I feel is really powerful. She said, deep beauty, cyclical in birth and death. And of course, you can see it on the sort of more somewhat superficial way of the circular economy and how do we bring the materials back. But really also using the power of art to celebrate the beauty in collapse, decay, and dying, because that is part of what now needs to happen. Systems that are no longer fit will collapse and crumble, and we have been in collapse for decades. It's not about a conversation of, oh, is society collapsing or not? There is a system collapsing while a new system is being built, and the jury is out which one of the two will happen faster and more furious. And we have this opportunity to either build the resilience, the community resilience structures to weather the disaster that climate emergency and Extinction Rebellion is warning us to pay attention to, or we have an inkling of a chance to somehow make this spread like wildfire, and we can only do it through arts and creative industries. Like, we need the musicians to come on board and sing about the regeneration rising, then billions will come along, and a percentage of them will join in. And then things can happen, that we can actually make it through the eye of the needle in the next 10, 20, 30 decades. It's not a quick job, easy gratification, 4-year economic cycle, and it's over and done with. It's a long and bumpy ride of 30 years, but if the arts and cultures get on board now, we have a chance.
And one aspect of what you're talking about, the very last thing you said about this is not a 4-year economic cycle, relates directly to another question, another prompt that we have from Sane. I hope I've said that right, which is, how do we make the market? How do we make, and I imagine that they're talking about the arts market, the funding networks, as Bridget was briefly mentioning. How do we make the market support and promote this kind of trauma-sensitive, participatory, ecocentric art? I know that, you know, Bridget and Lisa, you've both been successful in that kind of work. Lisa, do you have thoughts on that? Either of you, both of you, who wants to put a hand up?
I think I would prefer to pass it over to you if you're willing, because you're willing.
Okay, I can have a quick go. I'm sorry. I wouldn't say that success for us means money. I just blow the trumpet of Culture Declares Emergency and Climate Museum a lot. But I would like to, I think for me, I prefer to think about the role of the public sector to fund and support culture. I think that this is the real problem, that that under Tory rule that that culture has been made to behave like a business and to justify itself in a quantitative way by promoting tourism, by selling retail. It's that whole commodity culture that we really have to challenge. So I'd really want to look at the structures for public funding, not just of culture per se, but also education and all of the means where culture can be valued, the health sector, for example. It's really about making the case to those who are in charge of those finances, whether they are sponsors or governments, to show that people need the market. People need salutogenic, healthy cultural practices that connect them to place and people. And it's, we just have to keep making the case for that by demonstrating in work like Lisa's and showing that people want it, that people really flourish and benefit when they take part.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that we in many of our countries in America, the Americas and Europe, or North America at least, in Europe, we're talking about a cultural funding system that has become increasingly of the mindset that the arts, in its broadest sense, has to do something other than making art. There has to be some other end result, and yet we still don't seem to be at that point where this, the biggest question on the planet, is considered useful as one of those results. But it does feel, and Bridget, you would know this much, much better than I, it does feel like that's changed in the past 10 or 15 years somewhat. Is that wrong? Maybe not in America, but perhaps in some parts of Europe.
I'm not really sure. That would need a study, okay. I think. I don't know.
Sorry.
Just briefly on that subject, I think that there is another huge potential that we haven't really as a movement explored, which is that while it's dysfunctional that there's a 0.001% of people with huge amounts of money that are in that game of art buying, if you can get into the arts work, you can get into these family office, very large financial capital families, and through the arts taking messages that would otherwise not reach these elitist ivory tower people is actually a really powerful strategy. But it also requires, just as with music, it requires people who already have a very wide reach to say, okay, I'm gonna, like, and I'm beginning to see this happen, sort of the idea that you get 5 or 6 relatively well-known artist friends to donate one of their paintings, and then you create a benefit event where these are auctioned, and there's also a showcase of regenerative work in a certain place. And then that money goes to these organizations. And those kind of, sometimes in a very local way, sometimes in a more respectable artist, like, or international artist way, these kind of things are beginning to happen. And I think we shouldn't, like, it's transition skills to tap into those pots of money and try to use them creatively.
Sorry about that. Forgot about that. So we only have 2 or 3 minutes left in our time. I feel like I should ask the 3 of you in our panel if you have a final thing that you'd like to say, a final question you would like to ask or answer, or even just a recommendation of, there's been some really nice things in the chat of links to follow, books to read, I don't know if there's any music in there yet, but maybe I'll put something in, but and 1 or 2 films. Is there anything else that any of you would like to say about our topics, or something closely, not even that closely related? Shall we start? Lisa, do you have anything you want to throw out there as a final say?
I guess what comes to me is just a couple of projects that are upcoming for us that I feel excited to share with you. And I think they're, positive signs of the type of collaborations that can happen. We're working with a local arts organization to us, Finland Bay Arts, and we're working on a project that they're really spearheading called the Unexpected Garden. And the idea of this is that gardens, they'll support to kind of pop up in these unexpected places throughout the town, working together with regular people, local people, with organizations that are already growing food in different ways. And it will go on throughout the year and then culminate in a harvest festival. And in many ways, it's kind of a surprise, what happens there and what the art ends up looking like. But I think it's really about community. It's about connecting the different players that are already doing this work in a way that's celebratory and that's coming together, and that provides this real moment and experience that everybody can participate in. And another project at the Falkirk Wheel, working with Dandelion, we're making a living food sculpture. And again, it's a experience where people will get to taste the food that's growing on this floating ecosystem there. So just to share those with you.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I should have asked directly for you to tell us what you're up to. Bridget, how about you? Do you have a final statement?
I'll just say 2 things. One is sign up to declare emergency with Culture Declares if you haven't yet. Individuals can do it as well as organizations. We have a new website coming soon that's a much broader kind of toolkit to encourage you to take action in multiple ways. And the other thing is that Climate Museum UK is a distributed museum, and new associates are welcome. So if you are interested in developing creative, conversational, dialogic, participatory practice. So yeah,
fantastic.
2 invitations.
And those links are in the chat, are they not?
Possibly. I'll make sure they are.
Okay, great. And Daniel, how about you? Can you give us a fare thee well?
Well, yeah, so much to talk about. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for all the people who came in and spent their time, chose to gift us the power of their attention. And I put in the chat lots of stuff. Chris just put that she, in the thank you email, will actually harvest all these links so people can have them in a better format. I'm dreaming into having another conversation like this with friends of mine that I've created the Regenerative Consciousness Facebook page to, if you're on Facebook. Jodie Harbert, I put the link in as well, and Christopher Chase. And because they're both artists that have basically put their artwork in service to this transformation of consciousness and worldview and relationship and being in right relationship. And then I also put in, because the funky visual artists that are working in the computer space of computer animations have come together to do this beautiful project, which is a globally crowdsourced project called El Futuro Imposible. And they're looking for graphic designers who are doing computer graphics. You can check out the link. It's amazing work, working with Vandana Shiva and all sorts of people. And then what else did I have? Because this is a whole nother conversation. Somebody put in, I'm a musician and playwright, and I'm also working regeneratively. Like, yes, the musicians are at the center of this as well. This was much more focused on the creative arts in terms of visual arts. But I've had different inroads with conversations in the music industry, and among them, the founder of Playing for Change is very keen on getting involved in messaging the regeneration rising somehow. And if you don't know Playing for Change, I'll put the link in. It's a wonderful music project working for a better world. And yeah, again, thank you everyone. In the interest of time, I'll leave it there.
Thank you all so much. I'm sure Hawkwood wants to say a thank you and goodbye as well. But this has been really, I mean, personally, as an audience member, as the audience's proxy, I've enjoyed this so much and learned so much. Thank you, everyone, and all of you who've joined us. I throw back to Hawkwood.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. What a rich conversation. What an honor, and what a great way to start the year, as I said before.